Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Hey there, night owls and dreamers. Tonight we're diving into something surprisingly relatable. Sleep. But not just any kind of sleep. We're going back in time to explore how people in the medieval world slept. And trust me, it's far stranger and maybe even wiser than most of us could imagine. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slow, thoughtful journeys through history and human nature, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe. Only if it genuinely resonates with you. And if you're up for it, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet kind of magic, knowing this moment is being shared across time zones, across continents, across quiet bedrooms and sleepy cities. Now, if you haven't already, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft white noise. Get comfortable, and let's begin. Long before electricity, TikTok, or blue light filters, before sleep apps and circadian hacks, people had a very different relationship with the night. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't one long, unbroken stretch. It came in two parts, like a song with a pause in the middle. They called it segmented sleep, a natural rhythm of rest that began shortly after sunset. People would drift into what they called first sleep, a deep, restorative slumber that lasted about 4 hours. Then, almost like clockwork, they'd wake up, not by accident, not in distress, just awake for an hour or two, peacefully, purposefully. And in that quiet pocket of midnight, they lived. They prayed, they wrote, they rekindled fires, they checked on animals or sat in silence. Some even visited neighbors. It was known as the watch, and it wasn't seen as strange or inconvenient. It was simply part of the night's rhythm, a soft interlude before returning to second sleep. And yes, this was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval medical texts and marriage guides described it as a moment when the body was rested and the mind at ease, which, let's be honest, might be an old-fashioned way of saying no one's in the mood to argue. There's something strangely beautiful about this idea, isn't there? That sleep didn't have to be forced. That waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a problem to fix, but an opportunity to reflect, reconnect, or just be. They weren't fighting their biology, they were flowing with it. Maybe we've lost something in our chase for perfect sleep. Maybe waking up at 3 a.m. isn't always insomnia. Maybe it's your body whispering, let's sit quietly together for a moment. Let's listen to the night. So tonight, if you find yourself lying awake in the dark, don't panic. Don't reach for your phone right away. Instead, breathe, stretch, light a candle, write something, think something, feel something. Let it be your own little medieval watch, a pause between dreams. If this journey spoke to you tonight, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if this kind of storytelling helps you wind down. And until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, the night is more generous than we think. If you've ever thought you were being romantic for waking up early just to make your partner a cup of coffee, well, just know your ancestors had a very different idea of intimacy. Back in medieval times, people didn't sleep in one continuous block like we do today. Instead, sleep came in two parts. They'd go to bed after nightfall, wake up around midnight, and spend an hour or two in a quiet space between dreams. Some would pray, some would read or tend to chores. Some would simply sit in the silence or share it with someone they loved. Then came the second sleep, a return to rest until the first light of morning. It wasn't strange. It wasn't insomnia. It was just life. Even writers like Chaucer casually mentioned this two-part sleep, which tells us that waking up at 2 a.m. wasn't a problem. It was expected. It was ordinary. Ironically, modern science now suggests this segmented sleep might actually be more natural. Without artificial lights and the pressure of a 9-to-5 world, our bodies naturally slip into this rhythm. The space between first and second sleep may have been when people were most present, with their thoughts, their fears, their prayers, their stories. So the next time you find yourself staring at the ceiling in the quiet hours before dawn, don't panic. Don't reach for your phone or curse your restlessness. Instead, take a breath. Whisper to yourself, "Ah yes, the watch has begun." Maybe light a candle or just sit with your own company for a while. This isn't a failure to sleep, it's a return to something deeply human. And speaking of sleep, let's talk about beds, or what passed for them in the medieval world. Today, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, sleep apps, cooling gels, and whether our mattress makes us feel like we're floating. Back then, a bed was often just a pile of things that used to be alive, flattened by time, use, and the weight of hard days. The typical peasant bed was a straw mattress called a pallet, literally a sack filled with hay or just loose straw tossed on a cold floor. If you were lucky, there was a sack. If not, there was straw, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat. Comfort wasn't the point, survival was, and yet people still rested. They still dreamed. Even on straw beds and hard earth, in the chill of stone homes with smoky air and aching limbs, they found their way into sleep, and sometimes into love, into laughter, into peace. Because the truth is, rest was never about perfection. It was about surrender. And maybe that's the real lesson. Sleep doesn't need to be flawless. Nights don't need to be uninterrupted. What we need is gentleness. For ourselves, for our rhythms, for our restless midnight souls. Now picture this. You're settling in for the night. Not on a plush mattress, not beneath soft sheets, but on a pile of straw. It kept the cold at bay, sure. Straw was nature's budget insulation, but it also made a perfect home for things that crawled and crept. Bugs, lice, and the occasional field mouse. Sleep wasn't relaxation, it was stillness. Careful, cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If something bit you, you shifted slightly and hoped it didn't have friends. If your family had a bit of coin, or a strong enough back, you might lift the straw off the floor with a wooden frame. That didn't make things dramatically better, but it did lower your odds of waking up with a beetle in your ear. Slightly. Bed sheets? That was luxury. Most people just slept in the clothes they'd worn all day, dirty, tired, and unchanged. Pajamas didn't exist, and neither did personal space. Families slept together, side by side, sometimes on the same straw pile. Parents, children, grandparents, all sharing warmth and breath and dreams. If you got too hot, you simply rolled into someone's elbow. Of course, the nobility had it better. Real beds with wooden frames, feather-stuffed mattresses, hand-embroidered linens, and thick canopies meant to block out the cold and hopefully the lice. These beds were so valuable, they were passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. But for most people, a bed wasn't about comfort, it was about survival, a place to not freeze, a place to avoid chickens, a place to lie down and maybe, just maybe, dream a future where your bed didn't rustle, squawk, or bite. And then there's the nightcap. Today, we think of a nightcap as a cozy little drink before bed, whiskey by a fire, followed by questionable decisions. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was no beverage. It was an actual hat. A ridiculous-looking, but utterly practical piece of fabric. Something to keep your head from freezing off in your sleep. Because medieval homes weren't known for insulation. Cold stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made from animal horn or oiled parchment weren't exactly cozy. Central heating, that was called a dog, or several. To keep heat from escaping through their scalps, people wore nightcaps to bed. Some were short and simple, others long and pointed, like something a wizard might wear when he's not busy summoning dragons, just trying to stay warm. Yes, it's funny to imagine, but it's also a glimpse into a world that found resilience in the ordinary, in straw beds and shared warmth, in lumpy heirlooms and goofy hats, in the art of surviving the night with whatever you had and whoever you had beside you. Because at the heart of it, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was about getting through the dark, together. Long before heated blankets and central air, when winter crept in through stone walls and wooden slats, people clung to whatever scraps of warmth they could find. Enter the humble nightcap, often made from wool, linen, or any fabric spare enough to be repurposed without upsetting the family goat. For men, it was simple and practical. For women, it was something more. Part accessory, part necessity. Sometimes it doubled as a coif, wrapping their heads not just in fabric, but in centuries of custom and modesty. And of course, it discreetly hid hair that hadn't been introduced to soap since the last Lent. But warmth wasn't the only reason people wore them. In many regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, yes, even while asleep. A nightcap wasn't just an article of clothing. It was a quiet symbol of duty, decorum, and social status. Some were embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth. Because in a world without Instagram, what better way to show off than to go to bed with a tiny flag of prosperity stitched onto your forehead? In cities, the nightcap even became its own kind of statement. If someone opened the door wearing one, it was the medieval version of "do not disturb," a gentle but firm way of saying, "I'm off duty, please go away." Also, yes, this is my bedtime hat. Naturally, these caps were usually paired with nightshirts, long, loose tunics that looked like something out of a Charles Dickens novel. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the ghosts and moral epiphanies. Sleepwear wasn't meant to impress. It was itchy, oversized, occasionally flammable, but it did the job. Fast forward to now, and the idea of sleeping beside a stranger sounds like the setup for a travel horror story. A red-eye flight, an overbooked hostel, a confused Airbnb listing. But in medieval Europe, sharing a bed with a stranger wasn't unusual. In fact, it was expected. Let's say you're a merchant, a pilgrim, or just an unlucky traveler whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, which is already a miracle, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get isn't a room, or a bed of your own, or even a guaranteed clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed. A bed that someone else, or several someones, is already in. These inns function more like communal bunkhouses. Privacy? Not really a thing. If there was room in the bed, you were sharing it with strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or come with a few too many boils to feel entirely safe. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was real. In a world where survival depended on community more than convenience, sleeping shoulder to shoulder with a stranger was just another part of being human. And maybe in some strange way, there's something beautiful about that. About how the past reminds us that connection, even the awkward, itchy, poorly lit kind, has always been a part of how we make it through the dark. Imagine arriving in a medieval town at dusk. You're tired, cold, and just hoping for a place to rest. There are no reservations, no front desks, no room keys, just a crowded inn, a few creaky beds, and one spoken rule: if there's space, you take it. Sharing a bed wasn't considered rude, it was just practical. A single mattress might host 2, 3, even 4 strangers, depending on its size and everyone's level of tolerance. In larger cities, you might find yourself in a long, drafty hall lined with beds, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. Personal space didn't exist. Snoring competitions went unjudged. Elbow territory was earned, not given. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to group people by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But more often than not, it was first come, first sprawled. To the modern mind, especially the germ-conscious, this might sound like a nightmare. But back then, it was a luxury, because the alternative was sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the very real chance of waking up to find your shoes or your mule missing. Most travelers learned to sleep with their money tied to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Some lay directly on top of their bundles, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If something moved in the night, so did you, usually just in time to keep your purse. The wealthy didn't deal with this, of course. Nobles traveled with entourages and could demand private rooms if the innkeeper valued roof and reputation. For everyone else, sleep was something negotiated, with the environment, with strangers, sometimes even with fear. But here's the part that's easy to forget, and strangely beautiful. For many in the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just the end of the day. It was a spiritual ritual. Sleep was seen as a kind of small death, a moment when the soul might wander. And so, before closing their eyes, people didn't reach for lavender spray or a soothing podcast. They whispered prayers, they confessed their sins, they asked for forgiveness, just in case they didn't wake up. Good night wasn't just a kind wish. It was a hope, a fragile, sacred hope, that the night would pass gently and that morning would return. And maybe, in those quiet hours, lying shoulder to shoulder with strangers, hearing the breath of others in the dark, there was also comfort, a soft, human closeness. A reminder that none of us sleep entirely alone in this world. Not really. The idea was painfully simple. You could die at any moment, from illness, fire, famine, or just the misfortune of turning 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers. not because they were comforting, but because hell was terrifying. You didn't pray before bed for peace. You prayed because you were scared of damnation, of devils, of dying in your sleep and waking up on the wrong side of eternity. And you really didn't want to arrive there uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. There was a popular bedtime prayer back then. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet? Maybe. But it's also a legal declaration of mortality written by a 7-year-old, acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Adults had entire libraries of prayers, one for when you felt guilty, one for when you suspected the devil was lurking in the rafters, one for plague prevention, though history tells us that one didn't age too well. Some prayed to specific saints, celestial bodyguards stationed at the gates of sleep, protecting your soul like divine bouncers at a very exclusive club. The truly devout, monks, nuns, and anxiety-ridden nobles, ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After that, they took a vow of silence, not because it was sacred, but because they were exhausted, half-starved, and still a little afraid of the dark. Children were taught to pray too, partly to protect their souls, partly to keep them from asking why the dog was in their bed again. Parents would say, "Angels are watching over you," which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In truth, bedtime prayer wasn't about finding peace. It was about last-minute spiritual damage control, like a medieval antivirus scan. You didn't always know if it worked, but you ran it anyway. And then there were dreams. Today, we brush them off as weird side effects of stress, cheese, or our brains sorting files in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were sacred. They were messages, omens, warnings, not to be ignored. A dream could come from God, or a saint, or your guardian angel, or maybe the devil, or that suspicious relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were seen as revelations. Others were temptations. Either way, you were expected to take them seriously. Write them down, confess them, fast for 3 days just in case. Because back then, when life was short and eternity was long, every prayer, every dream, every whispered word before sleep, it all mattered. It was their way of saying, I'm still here, I'm still trying. And in the darkness of a world without electricity or certainty, that might have been the bravest thing of all. In the medieval world, dreams weren't just nighttime curiosities, they were serious business. Theologians, monks, and self-declared visionaries devoted countless hours, even lifetimes, to decoding their meaning. Entire books were written to interpret them. Dream of fire, you might be flirting with damnation. Dream of water could mean purification or a drowning soul. Dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, you might want to call a priest immediately. And maybe move out of town. To medieval minds, dreams mattered because the soul never truly slept. While the body rested, the spirit was believed to wander, exposed, vulnerable, and occasionally visited by things not of this world. That meant your midnight adventures weren't just fantasy, they were evidence. They could reveal secret sins, unspoken guilt, or spiritual weakness lurking beneath the surface. Even something as innocent as dreaming about stealing a loaf of bread might be taken as a sign of deeper gluttony or moral failing. Or maybe you were just really hungry. Still, just to be safe, it was better to confess it. In monasteries and convents, dreams were often shared with spiritual superiors, written down in the quiet hours before dawn, whispered during morning prayers. Some were revered for having holy visions. Others were gently advised to eat fewer onions before bed. But dreams weren't just tools for confession or caution. They were a portal, a sacred stage where the divine and the diabolical danced through metaphor. Medieval literature is filled with dream sequences where knights met angels, beasts, or cosmic riddlers, reciting poetry about justice, sin, and redemption. Dreams were, in many ways, the Netflix of the Middle Ages, though heavier on symbolism and lighter on happy endings. Of course, the church kept a wary eye. Not all dreams were seen as divine. Some were considered traps planted by demons to lead the innocent astray. If you dreamed of something shameful or strange, it might mean your soul was under attack. Or it might just mean you fell asleep too close to the fireplace and inhaled a bit too much smoke. Today, some of us share our beds with pets, a quirky, cozy, sometimes smelly habit. But in the Middle Ages, curling up beside an animal wasn't cute, it was survival. Medieval homes weren't exactly warm. Stone walls, no insulation, and winds that howled through the cracks like restless ghosts. Central heating? That was called the family pig. In medieval peasant homes, the line between family member and farm animal was often blurred, not out of affection, but out of pure necessity. It wasn't just common for humans and livestock to share a room, they sometimes shared the very same straw pile. Chickens wandered wherever they pleased. Dogs curled at your feet, pigs snored softly near the hearth, and if you were lucky, none of them bit you before sunrise. This wasn't about coziness, it was about survival. Animals were nature's heaters, reliable, warm, and unlike certain relatives, didn't steal the covers. A large dog could keep your toes from turning blue. A cow tucked into a corner might raise the room temperature just enough to keep the frost off your breath. In the dead of winter, that made all the difference. For many, the home was a single room that held everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, even dying. Privacy didn't exist. Space was shared because there was no other choice. Children might drift off to sleep between their parents and a goat. A chicken might double as a living alarm clock. And hygiene? Best not to think too hard about it. The wealthy, of course, lived differently. Nobles didn't bunk down beside livestock, at least not the barnyard kind. They did, however, share beds with lapdogs, not for warmth, but for fashion, and to graciously redistribute fleas. Some castles even featured designated sleeping quarters for pets, because what's power if your dog doesn't have its own room and honorary title? Still, sleeping with animals wasn't without its downsides. Animals are noisy, they roam, they do not respect personal space, but medieval folks adapted. A snout in the ribs or a hoof to the face at 3 a.m., just another Tuesday night. So, if you've ever shared a bunk bed in a noisy hostel and thought, this is a bit much, allow us to introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory, where comfort went to die quietly beneath a vow of silence. Monasteries weren't built for comfort, not the physical kind at least. Personal space didn't exist. Neither did softness, or even the idea that rest should be pleasant. In these silent stone halls, sleep wasn't a refuge, it was another form of discipline. Picture a long, cold dormitory filled with rows of monks, lined up like silent sentinels of devotion. Each bed, if it could be called that, was just a wooden plank, bare and uninviting. If the abbot was feeling generous, or if the calendar granted a feast day, there might be a layer of straw to soften the hardness. But most nights, you lay down knowing comfort was not the point. You slept fully dressed, not out of modesty, but because waking at 2 a.m. for prayer was easier if you were already prepared. The robe, the belt, the sandals, all part of your daily uniform, all worn through the night. They served not just as clothing, but as quiet reminders. You were here not to indulge the body, but to train the soul. There were no pillows, no curtains, no hushed conversations. Silence wasn't suggested, it was sacred. Even the smallest groan, a restless toss, a whispered sigh could be enough to earn you a week of chamber pot duty. Snoring? A spiritual gray area. You couldn't help it, but your brothers might still lovingly hold you accountable. One candle might flicker dimly at the far end of the room. That was all the light you had. Not enough to see clearly, but just enough to remind you that this too was a kind of watchfulness. The night wasn't for dreaming, it was for staying still, for letting go. And yet, in that austerity, there was a strange kind of grace. Monks believed that these beds of wood and silence were training for the soul, rehearsals for a kind of spiritual endurance. Sleep was scheduled, monitored, stripped of comfort. It wasn't something you surrendered to, but something you approached with purpose. A necessity, yes, but never a luxury. Some monks even chose to sleep sitting up, to avoid temptation, to avoid dreams, to avoid anything that felt too soft, too easy. They weren't here to be comfortable, they were here to be free. Compared to this, a peasant's straw mattress, shared with pigs perhaps and snoring relatives, seemed luxurious. At least the pig didn't enforce silence. At least it didn't ask you to deny your body. At least it let you dream. And just as your limbs finally began to sink into the stillness of night, the bell would ring. Sharp, relentless. 2 a.m., time for prayer. You rose not because you wanted to, but because you had promised to. Because this was the life you chose, or perhaps the life that chose you. In the monastery, even sleep was sacred. Even silence had weight. And the night was never really yours. It belonged to something greater. Imagine being woken in the deepest part of the night, not by an alarm clock, but by the solemn toll of a bell echoing through stone corridors. It's so early that even the owls are still undecided about whether to wake up. The bell isn't rung out of enthusiasm, but more likely because someone drew the short straw. A procession begins, robed figures moving silently through the cold, dark halls of the monastery. No one speaks. No one yawns too loudly, and no one wears pajamas. Monks didn't believe in bedtime comfort. The only layering system they trusted was spiritual discipline. They enter the chapel by candlelight. Shadows dance across ancient walls. The air is thick with smoke, incense, and the quiet determination of sleep-deprived souls trying to stay upright. They chant psalms, recite scriptures, and struggle, not with doubt, but with drowsiness. And if you happen to nod off during matins, congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last for an hour. In some devout communities, even longer. Try to imagine that, standing in a stone chapel at 3 a.m., stomach growling from last night's humble bowl of lentils, your body aching for rest, and yet you press on, not because you're strong, but because you believe. And when it ends, you don't crawl back into bed, at least not always. In stricter orders, monks moved straight into study or labor, because nothing says spiritual dedication like threshing wheat after 4 hours of fragmented sleep. But why do this at all? Why give up warmth, comfort, rest? Because for them, it meant giving God the first, quietest part of the night, before the world intruded, before the body's needs screamed too loudly. It was an offering, a surrender, a practice in turning stillness into sacred space. In today's world, sleeping alone is seen as a luxury, a symbol of independence, self-care, even peace. But in the medieval world, sleeping alone was almost unthinkable. Not because of fear or superstition, but because of cold, hunger, and survival. Beds weren't warm. Stone walls didn't trap heat. Central heating was still centuries and several plagues away. So people huddled together not for comfort, but for necessity. Children slept with siblings. Parents slept with their kids. Visitors might find themselves sharing a straw mattress with the host's cousin. It wasn't intimate. It wasn't romantic. It was life. In those cramped, itchy, cold conditions, sleep was a communal act, a fragile truce with the night, wrapped in shared breath and borrowed warmth. And maybe, just maybe, there's something profoundly human in that. Something we've forgotten in our pursuit of perfect silence, perfect space, perfect sleep. That in the end, even in the dark, we were never meant to do it all alone. Imagine a sleepover where nobody asked if you wanted to be there, except this was your nightly reality. In medieval times, sleeping wasn't the private, quiet affair we treasure today. Instead, it was a shared, sometimes crowded experience. The warmth of many bodies huddled together wasn't just about comfort on cold nights. It held a deeper, almost spiritual purpose. People believed the night was when the devil and dark spirits worked overtime, prowling in shadows and seeking out lone souls. To be alone in the dark was to be vulnerable. Vulnerable to temptation, to evil influences, even to possession. Having others nearby was like creating a protective shield, a moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would be there to see it, or better yet, to catch the demon before it got you. For children, the idea of sleeping alone was practically unthinkable. It wasn't just about fear or loneliness. It was about survival in a world full of ghosts, fairies, and restless spirits who wandered the night. Stories warned that solitary sleep was a doorway to mischief and spiritual danger. Unlike the bedtime tales we tell today, which end in comfort and safety, these medieval stories often ended in disappearances or worse. Even married couples rarely enjoyed a bed to themselves. It was common to share space with children, servants, or unexpected guests. Privacy wasn't a concept people clung to. It was a luxury, or in some cases, a suspicion. 2 people alone in a large bed would have seemed wasteful or even scandalous. In religious life, monks often slept communally. If someone was singled out to sleep alone, it was usually a form of punishment, a way to isolate them. The medieval mindset was clear: sleeping alone invites sin, but sleeping together fosters accountability and safety. So next time you're curled up in your own quiet bed with your own blanket, in a room that smells only of calm and nothing like a barnyard, appreciate the peace. In medieval times, you'd probably be sharing that space with 2 restless kids, a snoring sheepdog, and maybe a cousin, all breathing and snuffling around you. And what about those moments when you've suddenly dozed off sitting upright in a lecture hall, on a bumpy carriage ride, or in a dentist's waiting room? Waking up with a stiff neck and a pang of regret? For most of us, that's an accident. But in the Middle Ages, it was a way of life. Some medieval people, especially the wealthy or the deeply religious, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? For several reasons, none of which sound especially restful today. Medical beliefs back then held that lying flat was bad for digestion and lung function. The balance of the body's humors, the vital fluids thought to govern health, could be disturbed by a flat posture. In a world where doctors feared a sneeze might shift your soul out of place, this made perfect sense. Sleeping upright was believed to prevent what they called congestion of the brain, a grim way of saying, don't drown in your own phlegm. So rather than a peaceful slumber, sleep could be an uncomfortable vigil, propped up to keep the body's delicate balance just right. In all these practices, sleeping together, waking in the night, sitting up to rest, we glimpse a very different world. One where sleep was not a passive state, but a lived, shared experience deeply entwined with faith, fear, and community. So tonight, as you lie down to rest, take a moment to marvel at the journey sleep has made, from crowded beds and midnight prayers to your own quiet sanctuary, and maybe, just maybe, listen for the whispers of those ancient rhythms still echoing softly beneath the hum of modern life. Second, there were deeply held spiritual concerns shaping how people slept. Lying flat on one's back was seen as dangerously close to the posture of the dead. The fear wasn't merely superstition, it was that by sleeping flat, you might confuse God, or worse, catch the attention of the angel of death itself. The idea of sharing the same posture used in funerals was unsettling, even forbidden. Superstitious? Absolutely. But remember, in medieval villages, your local priest wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was also the go-to health consultant. When faith and medicine were so tightly intertwined, it was wise to tread carefully and follow the rules, even when they seemed strange. So what did people do? They often slept partially reclined, propped up by large bolsters, pillows, or something akin to a wooden headboard. Imagine a medieval version of a lazy-boy. Nobles could get even fancier, with beds rigged at an angle to keep them in a semi-seated position. This not only helped with digestion after a hefty evening meat pie, but was also thought to guard against surprise attacks from demons in the night. Monks took this discipline to another level entirely. In the strictest orders, they might sleep sitting upright on hard benches or leaning stiffly against cold stone walls, with nothing but a coarse hood to dull the discomfort. This wasn't about comfort or health. It was a form of spiritual discipline and self-denial. The logic was simple. If you were too comfortable, you might fall into vivid dreams. And if you dreamed, there was the risk of sin. Sin meant confession, and that often happened at an ungodly hour, like 5 a.m. So, needless to say, medieval sleep wasn't about restful, restorative slumber. It was about virtue, discomfort, and a theology that could be downright confusing. Forget the usual haunted dreams or goblins lurking under the bed. For people in the Middle Ages, the real monsters were already in the sheets, tiny, persistent, and utterly indifferent to your prayers. We're talking about fleas, lice, and the infamous medieval bedroom mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's forte. Baths were a rare luxury. Laundry was expensive and laborious, and soap was sometimes made from dubious ingredients better left unspoken. Combine this with mattresses stuffed with straw, communal bedding, and the occasional live chicken wandering underfoot, and you had the perfect all-you-can-eat buffet for these unwelcome guests. Fleas and lice were so common that they were basically household roommates. Peasants battled them daily, but nobles, despite their feather beds and satin sheets, were not immune. In fact, some wealthier families even employed dedicated nitpickers, servants whose sole job was to comb through their master's hair and clothing, hunting down every last louse. Imagine having the job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Sounds prestigious, right? But your actual work? Battling invisible enemies every night while you try to sleep. Bedbugs were the silent assassins of medieval nights. These tiny vampires lurked everywhere, nestled in wooden bed frames, tucked into mattress seams, and even hiding in cracks of cold stone walls. When darkness fell, they emerged to feast, leaving their victims itching, twitching, and praying for just a moment's peace. If you ever wondered why medieval folks wore those long nightcaps and went to bed fully clothed, it wasn't just about staying warm. Sometimes their attire was more like armor, a line of defense against the relentless army of pests. The solutions people came up with ranged from mildly effective to downright bizarre. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy, hoping the scent would repel the unwelcome guests. Others placed garlic, onions, or even ashes right in their beds. Not much good for the bugs, but certainly a surefire way to kill any chance of romance. It wasn't only physical discomfort that plagued them. Fleas, in particular, were loaded with symbolism, seen as signs of sin and moral impurity. Every bite was a sharp reminder of the fall of man and questionable bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some oddly romantic. Because, well, nothing says I love you quite like, let us be united like the flea that bites us both. So while today's sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and flickering streetlights, medieval nights were broken up by scratching, twitching, and the creepy feeling that something was crawling on your leg, because it very likely was. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried falling asleep wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being ready to joust even in your sleep. To be clear though, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, and noisy. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag full of cutlery. Not exactly comfortable, but hey, a warrior's gotta be ready. But when war raged or danger lurked nearby, comfort took a back seat, because survival was everything. Sleeping partially armored became the safer bet. A knight on campaign might strip off only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate close at hand, just in case the enemy decided to throw an unwelcome midnight party. Imagine waking suddenly to the thunder of hooves, your heart racing as you fumble to suit up, still caught between a dream of humble turnips and the grim reality of battle. Inside besieged castles, men-at-arms might sleep clutching swords or axes like fierce, makeshift security blankets. Shields became pillows, ready to defend at a moment's notice. If the walls were breached, well, at least you wouldn't have to waste time dressing. Your armor was already on. Priorities, right? Of course, sleeping in armor was far from restful. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail has a knack for pinching skin in all the wrong places. Toss in cold stone floors, sparse bedding, the symphony of snoring comrades, and the flickering shadows from crackling torches, and you have a bedtime experience that ranks just slightly better than an airport terminal at 3 a.m. Even those not in battle sometimes kept light protection close while resting in risky regions. Traveling merchants or night watch guards might nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets that offered a bit of padding and defense, far more reassuring than the moral support of a prayer alone. And armor was anything but quiet. Roll the wrong way and you'd clank so loudly that everyone around might wake, convinced the apocalypse had arrived. In an age when nightly demons, lice invasions, and the occasional pig in your bed were par for the course, sleepwalking wasn't just an odd quirk. It was terrifying. If someone began wandering their chambers half asleep, it wasn't seen as stress or fatigue. No, they were thought possessed, cursed, or burdened with unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire itself. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the monks, was poorly understood and deeply feared. Rising from a straw pallet to shuffle silently across the room, staring blankly at a wall, wasn't a harmless sleep disorder. It was a devil's rehearsal dinner. Stories from the medieval era revealed just how unnerved people were by sleepwalkers. Imagine a man wandering through the night, clad in a long, flowing nightshirt, clutching a flickering candle. His eyes glazed over, lips mumbling strange Latin phrases, words he likely didn't even understand. As he stepped carefully over sleeping animals, villagers whispered, "Ghost? Heretic?" Perhaps both. Depending on your local priest's temperament, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed these nocturnal wanderings were the result of bad humors, especially an excess of black bile, a medieval catch-all explanation for any mysterious ailment. Others thought the soul briefly left the body during sleep, leaving the rest of the person to stumble about like a mule without a driver. To stop these midnight escapades, people tried everything. Herbal concoctions brewed with hope, prayers whispered over beds, iron charms hung above doorways, or in rural villages, simply tying the sleepwalker's leg to a sturdy chair. It sounds extreme, but consider this. Medieval homes had open fires, sharp knives within reach, and chamber pots precariously placed, ready to spill. One of the more bizarre rumors claimed that some sleepwalkers even climbed onto rooftops in their slumber. Whether fact or exaggeration, the fear of these somnambulant wanderers led to barred windows and theological debates, pondering whether a person could sin while unconscious. Most sleepwalkers, thankfully, merely paced hallways, murmured to themselves, or tried to open invisible doors. But if one stumbled into a church, the locals might see it as a divine message, or quickly call for a cleansing ritual just to cover all spiritual bases. If medieval life taught people one thing, it was how to sleep through chaos. Church bells ringing through the night, thunder shaking the rafters, animals bellowing, and even the occasional siege. These were just background noise for the sleep-deprived souls of the Middle Ages. Their own version of white noise. Take the bells, for instance. They marked every sacred moment of the day, dawn's first light, prayer times, meals, and, most jarringly, the ungodly hour of matins, ringing at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams would have been soundtracked by their relentless tolling. Eventually, the mind adapted. The bells became a lullaby to an overburdened soul. But it wasn't only bells that shaped the medieval night. Storms were frequent and terrifying. Without weather apps or triple-glazed windows, every thunderclap felt like the world might be ending. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees, filling the night with eerie sounds that made the darkness feel alive and threatening. Yet despite the chaos outside, people still slept. They had no choice. Life didn't pause for sleeplessness. The fields needed plowing, prayers had to be said, and Vikings weren't going to wait for a more convenient time to raid. In fact, even the most catastrophic events, invasions, famines, wars, and the Black Death, rarely stopped the rhythm of sleep. During the 14th century, as death carts rolled grimly through villages in the morning, many saw it not as a reason to panic, but as a harsh but familiar alarm clock. And if you didn't wake up, some believed it was a kind of mercy, a release from a harsh world. Records tell us of people sleeping soundly through earthquakes, barn fires, and even angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, yet bodies adapted. If you worked from sunrise to sunset, barely ate enough to survive, and spent your days dodging mud, taxes, and the ever-present fear of spiritual damnation, exhaustion would inevitably claim you, and when it did, you fell asleep hard. For others, sleep was an escape hatch, a temporary refuge from illness, grief, or the constant dread that the world might literally end, which, in their minds, seemed to be forecast about every century. They'd curl up beneath a cloak, whisper a prayer, and surrender to a much-needed nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. Take, for example, the winter of 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. The village was cloaked in more than just snow. It was wrapped in tension, suspicion, and a quiet fear that seeped into every timber-framed home and frozen field. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already hard. Salem had recently split from its neighboring town over politics and religion. Crops had failed, smallpox had ravaged nearby communities, and wars with native tribes left many traumatized. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, inheritance disputes fueled resentments, and outsiders, or anyone who didn't quite fit in, were treated with deep distrust. In this fragile world, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a rare moment of peace amid chaos, a brief surrender to vulnerability, in a place where danger lurked both outside and within. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, cold enough to seep into your bones and twist your spirit, and something in Salem was bound to snap. That snap came in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave in ways that no one could explain. They screamed without warning, threw objects with wild abandon, and twisted their bodies into unnatural shapes. Sometimes they would fall into hours of silence, their eyes wide with a terror that chilled the hearts of all who saw them. Neighbors started whispering in hushed tones, "They are cursed." The girls claimed invisible hands pinched and bit them, invisible forces tormenting their fragile bodies. Reverend Paris, desperate and bewildered, called upon the local doctor, William Griggs. After examining the girls and finding no physical ailment, Griggs delivered a verdict that would ignite a powder keg of fear: witchcraft. That single heavy word ignited the smoldering fears already lurking in the hearts of Salem's residents. In a time and place where witches were believed to be very real, dangerous servants of the devil lurking in the shadows, such an accusation was terrifyingly plausible. If evil could worm its way into the minister's own home, what hope did the rest of the village have? Encouraged and sometimes pressured by adults and peers alike, the girls began to name names. At first, they targeted women on the fringes of society, the outcasts, the misunderstood. But soon, their accusations reached the doors of the respected, the wealthy, even the devoutly pious. Salem was a small village, but the storm it unleashed would ripple far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark soon turned to anguished cries beneath the gallows, weaving a lasting legacy of suspicion and paranoia, a shadow that still lingers in the pages of American history. Once the idea of witchcraft took hold in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, grew bolder each day. They convulsed dramatically in courtrooms, screamed through prayers, and claimed to see dark spirits hovering over certain villagers, sealing the fate of many. It wasn't just the product of childhood imagination. This fear was something far more theatrical, far more public. It unfolded like a dark play on the stage of Salem, with every whispered suspicion and pointed finger feeding the growing spectacle. And most heartbreakingly, the first to be accused were those with the least protection: women already living on the fringes of a rigid society. Take Sarah Good, for example, a homeless beggar known to mutter to herself when turned away from doorsteps. To the fearful townsfolk, her quiet murmurs were curses in disguise. She smoked a pipe, snapped at children, and moved through the village like a shadow out of place. The perfect target because she refused to fit the narrow mold of a proper Puritan woman. Then there was Sarah Osborne, who hadn't darkened the church door in over a year. Worse yet, after the death of her first husband, she scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant, a bold act of defiance that painted her as dangerous and suspect in their eyes. And perhaps the most exotic figure of all was Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados living in Reverend Paris's household. Her stories, her accent, her strange folklore were foreign to the villagers, enough to spark fear and suspicion. When pressed, perhaps even beaten, she confessed to witchcraft, but her confession did not calm the storm. It unleashed it. Tituba spoke of a tall man dressed in black, a sinister figure linked to the devil himself, who demanded she sign a book. She told of strange animals appearing in spectral forms, yellow birds, red cats, and ghostly dogs, and most damningly, she named others, claiming the presence of more witches hidden among them. That was all the court needed. The door to hysteria swung wide open, and the floodgates of accusation poured through. Week by week, new names were added. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Old grudges found new life, cloaked in the guise of holy justice. Property disputes morphed into spectral battles. If a neighbor's cow suddenly dropped dead, it was the work of witchcraft. If a baby cried through a prayer, it was surely the devil's hand at play. Fear spread like wildfire, so intense that even the innocent stayed silent. To speak in defense of the accused was to risk suspicion on oneself. In this poisonous climate, silence was the only shield. And so the web of accusations grew, trapping the village tighter with every passing day. Reason and logic slipped away, replaced by a hysteria that held the town in its relentless grip. As the frenzy reached its peak and the community teetered on the edge of collapse, the colonial government finally stepped in. But by then, the damage was already done. Governor William Phips, newly appointed and determined to restore order amid the growing chaos, established a special court known as the Court of Oyer and Terminer, literally meaning to hear and determine in French. But what unfolded was far from just a court of justice. It quickly became a relentless engine of fear-fueled persecution. In June 1692, the court convened in Salem town under rules warped by panic and hysteria. The standard demands of solid evidence and credible witnesses were tossed aside, replaced by something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. This was testimony that the spirit or ghost of the accused had tormented the victim. Simply put, if someone claimed to have seen your ghost choking them in a dream, that was enough to condemn you. It didn't matter that you could have been miles away, even asleep in church. The court accepted that your spirit was working for the devil. The tragedy was that such evidence could neither be cross-examined nor disproved. And worse, children became the star witnesses, their seizures and shrieks in the courtroom growing ever more dramatic. Mary Walcott, one of the afflicted girls, would fall into convulsions the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If the accused glanced at her, she screamed. If they avoided eye contact, she screamed even louder. The spectacle was haunting, and the judges, including influential figures like Judge Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted these performances as truth without question. There were no defense lawyers. Such a concept was unknown in colonial trials. Accused individuals stood alone, facing a court stacked against them. Deny the charges, and the afflicted girls writhed in agony, making your innocence seem impossible. Confess, and you might escape execution, but only if you named others, turning the trials into a vicious cycle of betrayal. The system rewarded deceit and punished silence. The trials became public spectacles, drawing crowds from neighboring towns to witness the accused paraded in shackles, confused, impoverished, and nearly powerless. Yet even in the midst of this frenzy, not everyone believed in the accusations. Some questioned the justice of it all, but their voices were drowned in the roar of fear. Some townsfolk whispered quietly behind closed doors, wondering if perhaps the girls were merely performing, staging a cruel theater fueled by boredom or attention. Others quietly questioned why only the vulnerable, the outsiders, the misfits, those who dared live differently, were targeted. Yet few dared voice their doubts aloud. To openly challenge the court was to risk being labeled an enemy, not just of society, but of God himself. In Salem, reason had surrendered, and the law had become nothing more than a distorted mirror, reflecting fear, suspicion, and prejudice rather than truth or justice. It was June 10th, 1692, when the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. Bridget had never fit comfortably into Salem's narrow mold. She wore vivid red dresses that caught the eye and invited whispers. She boldly ran a tavern, a gathering place where laughter echoed and outsiders mingled freely. Long before, she'd faced accusations of witchcraft, allegations that had hung over her like shadows. At her trial, neighbors stepped forward, claiming her ghostly presence pinched them in the dead of night. Some swore their babies had fallen ill and died simply from her passing glance. They insisted Bridget kept enchanted dolls, hidden in secret corners of her home, ready to do harm. Bridget Bishop denied it all, fiercely maintaining her innocence even as suspicion closed tightly around her. But truth mattered little to a court already convinced. They pronounced her guilty. On a stark, windswept hill known grimly as Gallows Hill, Bridget Bishop faced the end. There was no prayer offered, no plea for mercy heard, just the swift tightening of a rope, the hushed gasp of a watching crowd, and the unyielding grip of silence that followed. With Bridget's death, Salem unleashed a machinery of fear and cruelty, churning relentlessly forward. Executions followed with brutal swiftness. On July 19th, 5 more lives were extinguished in a single tragic day. Sarah Good, a beggar whose poverty marked her as suspicious; Susanna Martin, whose independent spirit had made her enemies; Elizabeth Howe, who faced whispers and grudges for decades; Sarah Wilds, whose quiet defiance unsettled neighbors; and Rebecca Nurse, a gentle, elderly woman deeply beloved, her life rooted in kindness and devotion. Rebecca Nurse's conviction sent ripples of shock through Salem. The jury had initially proclaimed her innocence, struggling to believe such a gentle soul capable of evil. Yet under relentless pressure from hysterical accusations and the weight of public panic, they overturned their own verdict. Rebecca Nurse faced death with heartbreaking dignity, whispering a final plea: "I am as innocent as the child unborn." Those words hung in the air, haunting reminders of innocence betrayed by fear. But innocence held no power in Salem. the noose knew no mercy. By August, the gallows had become a grimly familiar sight, and by September 22nd, the deadliest day yet, 8 lives were lost in one chilling morning. A stark reminder that fear, when unchecked, leaves devastation in its wake, destroying lives not just through violence, but through silence and complicity. Salem remains a powerful lesson, an enduring reflection on how easily fear can twist justice, silence truth, and blind communities. It challenges us, centuries later, to have the courage to speak, to question, and to hold on to reason, even when all around us falls into darkness. Among the many caught in the frenzy was Martha Corey, a woman brave enough to question the very trials that condemned so many. Alongside her stood her husband, Giles Corey, whose fate was even darker and more haunting. Giles refused to enter a plea, neither guilty nor innocent, knowing that his silence would deny the court the power to convict him in a conventional trial. But the court was relentless. In response, they invoked an ancient English punishment, fort, pressing a man to death beneath a mounting pile of heavy stones. For 3 agonizing days, the stones were slowly, mercilessly stacked on Giles's chest. As the unbearable weight crushed the breath from his body, legend tells us his final words were defiantly simple: more weight. A haunting testament to courage in the face of unimaginable cruelty. By the time the hysteria finally subsided, 19 had been hanged. Giles Corey had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more died within the cold, damp confines of jail cells while awaiting their fates. Dozens confessed to crimes they did not commit, driven by terror and desperation, all in the desperate hope of sparing their own lives. Over 200 souls were accused in total. The gallows cast long, dark shadows not only over the hill in Salem, but over the hearts of everyone caught in the grip of fear. Fear had become law and justice, blindfolded, had been dragged mercilessly to the scaffold. While the public executions stole the spotlight, hundreds more languished in cramped, foul-smelling jails, their futures hanging by a thread, waiting for a verdict, or perhaps a miracle. Salem's tiny jail simply could not hold the flood of accused witches. Many were imprisoned in nearby towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to cold stone walls, left to starve, freeze, and be forgotten in silence. Most of those accused were not witches, nor were they outcasts or criminals. They were neighbors, friends, parents, and children, ordinary people caught in an extraordinary nightmare. Their only crime, a bitter quarrel with the wrong person or the misfortune of owning land someone else coveted. In many cases, personal grudges wore the guise of divine justice. A pig wandering into a neighbor's yard and dying? Surely witchcraft. Someone refusing to help gather firewood? A curse must have been laid upon the axe. Mary East, sister to the executed Rebecca Nurse, was among those ensnared by suspicion. A devoted mother of 7, known for her deep faith, Mary was initially released by the court. But when the afflicted girls fell into fresh fits, she was rearrested. That second arrest sealed her fate, another innocent soul lost to the dark tide of hysteria. In a final, desperate petition to the judges, Mary pleaded, not for mercy upon herself, but for the madness to stop before more innocent blood was spilled. Her words fell on deaf ears. Soon after, she was hanged, becoming yet another tragic casualty of the hysteria. Among the most heart-wrenching cases was that of Dorothy Good, the frightened 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was dragged into the nightmare, interrogated relentlessly. Under unbearable pressure, the terrified child babbled nonsensical answers that were cruelly interpreted as proof of witchcraft. Shackled and imprisoned for 8 long months, the young girl emerged mentally shattered, her innocence forever lost to the horrors she endured. Even pregnancy offered no sanctuary. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, who himself would later be executed, was found guilty and sentenced to death. But because she was with child, her execution was postponed, a delay that ultimately spared her life. She gave birth behind bars and was released only after the witch trials finally came to an end. Accusations multiplied like wildfire. Those accused, desperate to save themselves, confessed and named others in a frantic effort to shift the deadly spotlight. Entire families were swept up in the chaos, fathers, mothers, children. No one was safe from suspicion. Meanwhile, the prisons overflowed, bursting beyond capacity. Rations grew thin, disease swept through the overcrowded cells like a silent killer. Some perished in the grim limbo of waiting for their fate. caught in a nightmarish legal purgatory. And still, each week brought fresh names, fresh victims to the growing tally. In Salem, identity ceased to matter. What counted was who was willing or coerced to speak your name. By the fall of 1692, the fever of hysteria began to break. Not because the courts suddenly saw reason, but because reality forced its way back into the spotlight. The tipping point came when accusations grew too brazen, sweeping even those who had once supported the trials into the web of suspicion. Reverend George Burroughs, once a respected minister of Salem, found himself arrested and accused of leading the witches' coven. Learned, eloquent, and having clashed with some of the village's powerful families, he was an easy target. On the day of his execution, Burroughs delivered a shocking act of defiance. Standing before the crowd on the gallows, he flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, the very prayer witches were believed incapable of uttering without faltering. His calm conviction cast a shadow of doubt, signaling the beginning of the end for the trial's dark grip on Salem. The crowd fell into a heavy silence. Some wept openly, their sobs breaking the stillness. Even the most hardened observers, those who had long grown accustomed to the harshness of these times, were visibly shaken. Yet, despite the palpable sorrow and fear, the execution pressed on relentlessly. That harrowing moment planted a seed of doubt deep within the hearts of many. And then, the accusations reached a shocking new height. Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself, was accused. Suddenly, the hysteria wasn't confined to the shadows of the village. It had climbed to the very top of the colony's social ladder. Governor Phipps, already rattled by the growing criticism and mounting chaos, could no longer ignore the unraveling situation. In October 1692, he took the decisive step to dissolve the Court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending trials and executions. The machinery of fear and death ground to a tentative halt. Public opinion had begun to shift. Ministers who had been silent or complicit started to speak out against the madness. Among them was Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, who boldly condemned the use of spectral evidence, the ghostly visions and supernatural claims that had fueled so much terror. It were better, he declared, that 10 suspected witches should escape, than one innocent person should be condemned. A radical and unsettling idea in a society that, for months, had believed the exact opposite. Those who once cheered on the trials now found themselves wrestling with doubt and guilt. The prisons remained filled to the brim, but the thirst for more blood had begun to ebb. Too many respected community members had been dragged into the accusations. Too many innocent souls had been buried beneath the soil. The villagers slowly realized that this was not divine justice at work, it was madness. Confessions stopped flowing. Some of the accusers quietly retracted their claims, others vanished from public sight altogether. The voices that had once screamed the loudest now lowered to whispers, burdened by shame. The fear lingered, but it had lost its grip. Exhausted and fragile, the community yearned for peace and stability. Officials, eager to save what remained of their reputations, began to steer away from the chaos. Salem, battered and remorseful, was finally ready to awaken from its nightmare. The storm was breaking. Yet the scars left behind would take years, perhaps generations, to heal. By late 1692, the very judicial system that had fanned the flames of hysteria started to crumble under the weight of its own folly. After the dissolution of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time, the approach was markedly different. Spectral evidence was banned, and judges met accusations with skepticism rather than blind faith. The tide of madness was finally turning. The result was a dramatic shift. Convictions slowed almost to a halt. Many accused witches were acquitted outright. Of the 56 cases brought before the newly formed court, most were released back into the trembling arms of their communities. Even those who had once confessed began to withdraw their statements, admitting the terrifying truth that fear, torture, and relentless pressure had forced lies from their lips. The once convincing performances of the afflicted girls lost their grip on the court's imagination. The turning point came with the case of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister suddenly caught in suspicion's dark net. Though he was never formally charged, the fact that such a high-ranking devout man could be accused laid bare how arbitrary and corrupt the entire process had become. The court, once a fierce engine of accusation, grew cautious and hesitant. They quietly began releasing prisoners, first those with little evidence against them, then even some who had confessed under unbearable duress. Meanwhile, families of the executed rose up, demanding justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of their father's seized property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a heartfelt campaign to clear her name and restore her honor. Slowly, the fearful grip that had paralyzed Salem gave way to shame. Church congregations splintered. Friendships broke. The very fabric of the community was torn apart. Governor Phipps, aware of the colony's growing shame and the international spotlight, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But freedom was bittersweet. Many families were burdened with jail fees they had to pay just to reclaim their lives. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the cost of surviving. By the time the ordeal ended, 19 souls had been hanged, 1 crushed to death, 5 perished in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court didn't merely collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a void filled with grief, guilt, and disbelief. The trials had concluded, but the long, painful process of healing had only just begun. Salem was forever changed, not just by the people it lost or the justice it betrayed, but by the stark, unflinching mirror it was forced to face. The gallows stood silent, the jails lay empty, yet Salem was far from calm. The town wasn't haunted by spirits, but by the heavy weight of guilt. What began with a handful of sick girls had erupted into a devastating communal tragedy. Families were torn apart, reputations shattered, and innocent lives cut short. Now, those who survived were left to live amidst the ruins. Neighbors avoided meeting each other's gaze. The very people who once knelt side by side in prayer had become witnesses against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly slipped away from town, others faded into obscurity. A few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later express deep remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her part in the trials, attributing her actions to satanic delusion. But for many, the wounds ran too deep for words. Even the court officials bore the weight of the tragedy. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was among the few to openly admit fault. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 as a minister read his confession and a prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of accountability during a time when many preferred to forget. Yet forgetting proved difficult. Families of the condemned began demanding justice. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, calling for official pardons, restitution of property, and public recognition of the innocence of those executed. Gradually, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some victims and offered limited financial compensation to their heirs. But even this was incomplete. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were entirely excluded. Whispers of witchcraft never quite left New England, but in Salem, the shame became woven into the town's very identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps in a quiet attempt to distance itself from the dark shadows of its past. Gallows Hill, where so many lost their lives, was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not only the bodies, but also the haunting memories of what had transpired there. Yet, the memory refused to die. It lingered in whispered sermons, in old stories passed down, and in the heavy silences between neighbors who once called each other friends. Salem was not cursed by witches. It was cursed by fear, by pride, and by power left unchecked. And that curse lingered long after the last execution. Though the Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, their legacy continues to echo, not just in textbooks or historical tours, but deep within our collective understanding of justice, fear, and the fragile nature of truth. What unfolded in 1692 was far more than a bizarre episode of mass hysteria. It was a collapse of reason, compassion, and legal integrity under the crushing weight of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers became executioners simply because they believed too readily and questioned too little. The courts, meant to protect the innocent, became instruments of oppression. Religion was twisted into a weapon, testimonies turned into performances, and silence was taken as proof of guilt. One of the most chilling truths about Salem's tragedy is how swiftly it happened. Within mere months, fear drowned out facts. Old grudges, masquerading as spiritual battles, were transformed into death sentences. No demons or devils were needed. Just belief in their existence was enough. Yet, from this dark chapter came vital lessons that would ripple across American society for generations. The Salem trials became a stark reminder of the dangers of injustice and the need for safeguards in law. Nearly a century later, the framers of the U.S. Constitution explicitly forbade practices like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, measures that had condemned many in Salem. The rights to legal counsel, to confront one's accusers, and to require solid evidence before conviction were hard-fought protections, forged in part from the ashes of Gallows Hill. Salem's haunting story remains a powerful warning. When fear eclipses reason, justice can become its first victim. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become a shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, a phrase tossed around casually, often without any real sense of the terror those words once carried. But Salem was not a metaphor. It was a real town, a place where innocent people were hanged for crimes that existed only in fear and imagination. They were betrayed by the very systems meant to protect them. Courts, churches, and neighbors turned against them in a wave of hysteria. Perhaps the most lasting lesson from Salem is this: unchecked fear can become its own ruthless form of tyranny. And when that fear is given legitimacy by power, whether courts, churches, or governments, it can become almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials stand as a cautionary tale, not just about one village's descent into madness, but about how easily reason can collapse when fear is granted authority. The gallows are gone, the courtrooms are silent, but the warning remains. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself, unless we remember. Now turning to another story of power and ambition, we meet Fulvia. Born around 83 BCE, Fulvia entered the world within the elite yet slightly unconventional Fulvian family, an old plebeian house that had fought its way into the highest ranks of Roman politics. Though not counted among the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried ambition and a taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was better known for his hesitant, bumbling speech. His nickname, Bambalio, literally meant the stammerer. But Fulvia was no stammer. She was born to command. From a young age, she was immersed in the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy under her family roof. Elections, alliances, and betrayals were everyday news. She learned early on that politics wasn't just played out in the forum, but in marriages, funerals, whispered rumors, and shadowy backroom deals. In elite Roman households, women were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, obedient shadows behind the scenes. But Fulvia shattered every one of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, deeply connected, and fully aware of her own power. Though her early years remained shrouded in mystery, the actions she took later in life paint a picture of a young woman who was keenly observant, politically savvy, and utterly fearless. Fulvia wasn't content to fade into the background. She possessed a formidable personality, a sharp intellect, and a relentless will to act, even in the fiercely male-dominated arena of Roman politics. This was a time of unprecedented upheaval. The Roman Republic was unraveling. Civil wars raged, populist revolts ignited. Generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar battled for supremacy, turning Rome into a boiling cauldron of ambition and violence. The old rules were breaking down, and Fulvia was coming of age right at the heart of the storm. Rather than shrinking from the chaos, she learned to harness it. Her early life didn't shape a modest matron, the kind of woman Rome idealized. Instead, it forged a warrior of influence who viewed politics not as a men's domain to be feared, but as a battleground to be mastered. Fulvia would go on to marry 3 of the most powerful men of her era, each one a key player in the turbulent saga of Rome's transformation. But she didn't just marry into power. She commanded armies. She led revolts. She shaped the course of history with a force few women had ever wielded. And Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia refused to linger in mourning. In the ruthless game of Roman politics, influence was fleeting, and she understood that better than anyone. Soon after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, her first husband, she remarried, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. Known for his flamboyant style and theatrical flair, he was as much a showman as a politician. But beneath the bravado lay a sharp, calculating mind, a political operator who could hold his own in Rome's dangerous game. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio held immense power during one of Rome's most turbulent eras. The Republic was balancing precariously between war and peace, caught in the struggle between Caesar's soaring ambitions and the Senate's fierce resistance. To Fulvia, Curio was far more than just a husband. He was a vital bridge to the next wave of political power. This was no simple romantic rebound. It was a carefully calculated alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor, someone capable of carrying forward the populist legacy her first husband had forged, and someone firmly backed by Caesar himself. Curio fit the bill perfectly. Through him, Fulvia stayed deeply embedded in Rome's shifting power dynamics. She didn't merely marry into a movement, she helped to shape it. Fulvia made sure Clodius's supporters remained active, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged and mobilized. But the Roman world was unraveling rapidly. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey ignited into full civil war. Curio threw himself into the fray on Caesar's side. As always, Fulvia was politically involved behind the scenes, reportedly organizing support and managing resources to fuel her husband's campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but disaster struck. He was ambushed and killed by King Juba of Numidia's forces, his army decimated. Once again, Fulvia found herself widowed, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into obscurity. She did not. Curio's death only cemented her reputation as a political widow of formidable resilience. Having lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil strife, she emerged stronger and more determined. Remarkably, Fulvia became the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was more than ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was not your typical Roman aristocrat, comfortably navigating the established rules of society. He was a populist agitator, a man with an appetite for disruption, whose very existence seemed to challenge Rome's old order. Charismatic, daring, and deeply controversial, Clodius wielded chaos like an artist wields his brush, painting Rome's streets with scandal, rebellion, and spectacle. To Rome's entrenched elite, Clodius represented danger, disorder, a reckless agitator threatening centuries of carefully maintained tradition. But to the masses, he was their champion, a fearless voice who dared to confront the powerful. And for Fulvia, he was a strategic choice, an opportunity she grasped boldly, understanding the power inherent in aligning herself with a man who had transformed Roman politics into a thrilling, if perilous, theater. Their marriage, forged sometime in the turbulent early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had captivated and divided Rome. Clodius had already achieved notoriety through his theatrical defiance of convention. Infamously, he'd once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred, women-only religious ceremony held at Julius Caesar's house, an act of sacrilege that should have ended him politically, but instead it elevated him, turning scandal into spectacle, shame into popularity. But Clodius's ambitions stretched further. Determined to grasp real power, he renounced his patrician heritage, trading aristocratic privilege for the populist power of the tribunate of the plebs, an office granting him direct influence over the Senate itself. Few men understood the raw energy of Rome's streets as Clodius did. Yet Fulvia was no mere observer, no passive partner lingering quietly in the shadows. She stood confidently beside him, deeply involved in every calculated step he took. Historical accounts tell us Fulvia did not merely watch from afar, she actively shaped their joint political ventures. She engaged passionately with Clodius's supporters, managed their home as a political nerve center, and appeared prominently by his side at rallies and public events. Their household became a vibrant hub where populist ideals simmered and revolutionary plots brewed. Together, Fulvia and Clodius represented something utterly new. A fiercely ambitious power couple, populist icons, fearless agitators, unapologetically aggressive in their pursuit of influence. But such boldness carried inevitable risks, and tragedy soon struck. In 52 BCE, on Rome's famed Appian Way, Clodius's daring journey came to a violent end, murdered in broad daylight by the bodyguards of his political enemy, Titus Annius Milo. His brutal death shook Rome to its core, the city briefly stunned into silence. But Fulvia refused to let his death be a quiet tragedy. Instead, Fulvia turned her husband's murder into political theater. She orchestrated a funeral that resonated through the centuries, a dramatic procession where she paraded Clodius's battered, bloodied corpse through the Roman Forum. The graphic display of his wounds ignited outrage and grief in the hearts of Rome's citizens. Horror mixed with fury, grief became rebellion. Riots exploded across the city, and the flames of vengeance consumed the Senate House itself, reducing Rome's symbolic heart of power to ashes. In that pivotal moment, Fulvia transformed personal loss into an unprecedented political uprising. This act, raw and fearless, marked her emergence not just as Clodius's widow, but as a powerful figure in her own right, a political mastermind who knew instinctively how to channel public sentiment, how to turn emotion into action, grief into strength, and tragedy into triumph. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia stepped boldly into the light. The shadow she once stood in was replaced by her own blazing presence, one that Rome would not soon forget. Both had died fighting for populist causes. But Fulvia's story was far from over. Her boldest alliance and most dramatic chapter was yet to unfold. Her third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and steadfast ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged around 47 BCE, was far more than romance. It was a powerful merging of influence and ambition. By then, Fulvia had already established herself as a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rapidly ascending the military and political ladder, needed precisely that kind of savvy partner in Rome. Together, they became one of the most formidable political couples of the late Republic. Fulvia was no stranger to bloodshed and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony, known for his drinking, gambling, and scandalous personal life, found in Fulvia someone far more than just a companion. She was a strategist and protector of his interests, a force who held his alliances together and rallied supporters during his absences. Despite his brash exterior, Antony recognized her invaluable role. He entrusted Fulvia with unprecedented authority for a Roman woman. She opened his correspondence, issued orders while he was away, attended meetings, and influenced key appointments. Ancient Roman sources, mostly hostile, painted her as domineering and power-hungry. But what truly unsettled them was not merely her ambition, but the fact that she acted with the authority and boldness of a Roman man in a society that had no language or place for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Roman Republic plunged once again into chaos. While Mark Antony hurried to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, it was Fulvia who truly held the reins of Rome itself. As Antony forged the powerful Second Triumvirate alongside Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his steadfast representative in the capital. She managed complex patronage networks, coordinated with influential street gangs, and ensured Antony's supporters remained fiercely mobilized and loyal. Her political acumen extended even further. She orchestrated Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter Clodia to him, a strategic alliance that would later spectacularly unravel in public. Fulvia appeared not merely as Antony's wife, but as his proxy and political equal. Roman coins were minted bearing Antony's image alongside her name, an unprecedented and bold acknowledgement of her status. She did not hide behind the shadows of power. She stood fully illuminated in its glare. Yet power in Rome was always precarious and borrowed. Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could push before the traditional Roman order snapped back. While Antony embarked on military campaigns and political negotiations across the vast Roman world, Fulvia controlled the streets of Rome. She was not simply a consort, she was his regent in all but name. In a volatile era where violence, bribery, and raw influence dictated order, Fulvia demonstrated she could play the game as skillfully, if not more so, than any man in the Senate. Rome, after Caesar's murder, was a battlefield without swords. Power was fluid and dangerous. Fulvia understood this reality deeply and anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She directed allies, negotiated with the urban plebeians, brokered deals with rival factions, and, most daringly, waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to maintain public order, and ensured legislation favored Antony's ambitions and future. Some ancient sources, particularly hostile historians like Ion and Dio Cassius, portray Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even warmongering. Yet beneath these misogynistic exaggerations lies a woman actively engaging in politics at a time when no protocol existed for a woman to wield power beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was building coalitions, supporting military commanders, and even issuing decrees, roles traditionally reserved for senators and consuls. Her unprecedented political agency challenged the very fabric of Roman patriarchy and left an indelible mark on history. Fulvia was no mere bystander in the turbulent power struggles of the late Roman Republic. While Mark Antony campaigned far away in the east, she stepped boldly into the spotlight as the living embodiment of his authority in Italy. She wasn't just a figurehead. She made public appearances, built and maintained crucial alliances, especially with veteran soldiers whose loyalty was a cornerstone of Antony's strength. These men, hardened by war and fiercely protective of their rewards, found in Fulvia a fierce advocate who reminded them that their allegiance came with promises that must be kept. But such power and visibility came at a price. The Roman aristocracy, particularly those aligned with Octavian, Caesar's chosen heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, saw Fulvia as a dangerous force. To them, she was a meddling woman wielding an unprecedented level of influence over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her capacity to act decisively without male oversight wasn't just unusual, it was a direct challenge to the patriarchal order that ruled Rome. Fulvia was no fool. She understood the fragile nature of the alliance between Antony and Octavian. The cracks were widening, and the looming conflict was inevitable. More than that, she grasped something that neither Antony nor Octavian fully admitted yet. The Republic was no longer spacious enough for both of their ambitions. With this clarity, Fulvia began to prepare for a new chapter, one that would abandon diplomacy for outright confrontation. She had long stood behind the scenes, but now she was ready to seize power herself. In 41 BCE, she did the unthinkable. With Antony still campaigning in the east, Fulvia, alongside Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, boldly challenged Octavian's authority in Italy. Their stated cause was the defense of Antony's interests and the protection of land rights for the veterans who had loyally served him. But beneath that official justification lay a deeper struggle for control, power, and survival in a republic teetering on the edge of civil war. But beneath every move and maneuver, Fulvia's hand was unmistakable. This was no mere political squabble, it was a full-blown military rebellion orchestrated by a Roman woman. The first and only time in Rome's long history that a woman would openly incite and lead a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusian War, ignited over Octavian's contentious land redistribution plan, which displaced countless Italians to reward his veterans. Sensing the simmering unrest, Fulvia seized the moment, painting Octavian as a tyrant and a betrayer of Caesar's legacy. With Lucius Antonius as her public face in the Senate, and Fulvia pulling strings behind the scenes, they rallied 8 legions and took control of Perusia, the city we now know as Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient historians suggest she was far more invested in the rebellion than even Lucius himself. She rallied soldiers, stirred crowds into fervor, and maintained correspondence with generals in the field. Rome buzzed with whispers of her commanding legions, issuing orders with iron resolve. Her leadership forced Lucius into battles he'd rather have avoided. Octavian, taken aback but swift, laid siege to Perugia through the harsh winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and battering the city into submission. Trapped between starvation and political betrayal, Fulvia watched her daring gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, Perugia surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a strategic move to avoid alienating Antony. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who once commanded riots, orchestrated marriages, led armies, and swayed public opinion was now too dangerous to remain on Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, clinging to hope of reuniting with Antony. But Antony did not come. The powerful bond once shared by husband and wife had frayed amidst the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted boldly in his name, perhaps without his blessing. She dared to do what no Roman woman before her had dared: wage civil war, and the Republic had made sure she paid the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia arrived in Sixion, a city that had become a diplomatic limbo for fallen power players. She hadn't fought for herself, but for Antony's honor and interests. A fierce guardian of a legacy slipping through fractured alliances and shifting tides. And that brings us to the end of this story, one filled with tragedy, remorse, and the long journey toward justice and healing. What do you think about everything we've explored today? Did this story resonate with you? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And before you go, send some goodnight wishes to those around you. It's a small gesture that can mean a lot. Thank you for watching, and sleep well.